Hey guys, Shadowrick here with a quick video going over my thoughts on Aldrachi Reaver versus Felsguard in the Manaforge Omega raid. This is a video I've wanted to make for a while, but I wanted to get both my guides out before I did make this, so I could link them all together and kind of bring everything together. So, what I'm going to discuss in this video is, one, which builds I think are better on which bosses, and two, what trinkets to run for those builds as well. So, let's get into it. Now, the first thing I'm going to pull up is logs. In general, we have my logs as well as logs of every single fight that I can go take a look at. So, at least on my end, I will say that for Plexus Sentinel, I believe it is a Felsguard fight. I have one Aldrachi kill from early on when I was still just learning the fight and raid leading. For Lumathar, I also play Felsguard, which is what I originally recommended. This one's been pretty mixed bag. Aldrachi is also fine here. It has a bit of cleave in phase 1. It doesn't really matter enough either which way, kind of just your preference. Soulbinder, I think, is strictly a Aldrachi's better fight, both in overall damage as well as the fact that you gain significantly more boss damage from the funnel and the ads. Forge Weaver or Raz is the same. You gain funnel into the boss off the ads, plus it just has a damage profile that fits very well for the burst on the ads as you need it. Now, this is where I'm going to have my first hot take. I think Soul Hunters is actually a Felsguard boss. This isn't something that I had the take of until incredibly recently. Um, and it wasn't until I was just messing around on my alt DH in some random normal and heroic pugs that I realized that the Felsguard Mythic Plus build actually performs incredibly well on this boss, and really feels good because of the extended range on Immolation Aura. It makes up for the fact that there's a lot of time where the bosses are not stacked. You also don't have to play around Essence Break, and it's just generally a much easier build to play. So this wasn't the best pull that I had. And if I go look at our other pulls that we had right before, I had a pull where I was doing much more damage, especially up to the point where we ended up all kind of dying. We wiped due to something going wrong in the intermission. Had the boss died around a similar timing, I could have finished around 8.7 million. And then on this pull, I DC'd, or rather more, I had that bug where the game freezes for 5 seconds and got killed by a frontal, and that also kind of hurt my damage as well as just not as good RNG on this pull. But I really, really like and do recommend Felsguard for this boss, playing the Mythic Plus build. However, if you're not comfortable with this, Aldrachi is pretty similar. I just think Felsguard's easier and performs incredibly well. Next is Fractalus, which, again, this goes to being another Felsguard boss. Anything that is mostly pure single target is just Felsguard favored. Felsguard is better on pure single. And personally, I recommend the no mover variant, not the extra G1. That's also playable as well if you prefer it, but might as well keep it simple for very similar DPS. The last two bosses, we have Nexus King and Demensius. Now, for Nexus King, I hard recommend that Nexus King is an Aldrachi boss, having played it. I don't think Aldrachi can really perform worse than Felsguard would. So I just recommend it. You can be very flexible in progression as well, especially playing Nether Prism, because you can use your stacks of Nether Prism as well as any souls that you've saved for glaives and burn them on intermission platforms while you're progressing. And then on good pulls, you can save that and use that on the damage burn on the boss at the 430 timer and send the damage there instead. Whereas if you're playing Felsguard, you don't have the flexibility to move that damage to the platform, as well as also still hit the boss in the damage burn, and I think it's just less flexible, plus going to be less damage as there's a lot less pure single. And you get a good amount of time with 2 target on the boss where Isolated Prey will disable, that Aldrachi is simply going to perform better. Lastly, we have Demensius. I will note, I have not pulled Demensius yet. However, it is interesting to me that the top log is Aldrachi, while every other log is Felsguard. I am not convinced that one or the other is better. However, I do think it is the case that, typically speaking, Felsguard is just the easier build to play, and the increased range on Immolation Aura will allow for better Phase 1 damage, as there are some problems with the ads for Aldrachi in Phase 1. So I think this one's kind of remains to be seen, and this one is really just me going off of everyone before me, including Race to World First, where Felsguard has been extremely favored despite the fact that the top log is Aldrachi. I will recommend Felsguard for this boss, and I can update if I change my mind on this later when very soon I do get to Prague, as it feels like we are going to be killing Nexus King in the next short while, hopefully on Sunday. So, just go over all the bosses again. Plexus Sentinel, it's very heavily Felsguard favored, 97-3. With that being said, of course, you can play Aldrachi Reaver on any boss. However, you can also play Felsguard on any boss. I think it's less advisable to do so. I'll get into my reasoning for that in a second. Lumathar is still Felsguard focused. This was originally a lot more Aldrachi, and it did change over time. I'm not sure exactly what took people a long time to swap over, but either build is perfectly playable. Just kind of depends what you prefer. Next is Soulbinder, and Soulbinder, again, 97% Aldrachi. This one has an extremely high amount of ad damage that could be funneled into the boss. There is definitely ways that you could parse on this boss by having massive burst windows, especially with Nether Prism, playing Felsguard, and blowing up the large ad set, but I don't think there's really any value to doing so. In either way, this is probably the easiest boss in the raid, so it is the least relevant one. When we come to Arouse, it's 100-0 on Aldrachi Reaver. No surprise there, as with Forge Weaver, Aldrachi just feels like it was made for this fight. The way that you can move your damage around and have damage on the ad sets, plus all the boss funnel that you get off of that as well. Chef's kiss. Perfect boss for it. With Soul Hunters, we're going to see 98-2 on Felsguard. Now, again, with my hot take, I do think this might actually be a Felsguard boss. I'm, of course, one of those two parses, and the other one I'm going to have to scroll down to nearly the bottom. And it's HTG, who exclusively does play Felsguard, and he has exclusively played Felsguard for quite a while. I am actually curious to click in and see what he played build-wise. However, I will note his trinkets for this boss are illegally bad. Taking Sack of Terror is something to never run in a cleave scenario. By equipping this, because it's a mastery base instead of agility, you lose about 3% damage outright. So if the damage from the proc is not making up for that, plus doing damage on top of it, it's not going to be worth running. I'll check that in a second, but unless it's at about 5.5% damage, it is actively bad that he has this equipped. Second, he has Soulbreaker Sigil. This is a Delve Trinket that really just does pure single target damage. I imagine he just does not have access to good trinkets, as this is, again, pretty horrible for this boss. But it is agility stat based, at least, so that is fine. And looking at it, he is playing the exact same Mythic Plus build as I was playing. No real surprise there for me. Looking into the trinkets, as I mentioned, I'd want to see Volatile Detonation around 5.5% to be worth equipping. At 3.93, you're pretty much getting like 0.8% DPS out of this trinket. Any stat stick would be better. Soulbreaker Sigil is doing more than I would expect at 2%. Maybe it was a good pull for it, but the the Volatile Detonation is simply not going to perform well here. Next, we have Fractalus coming in here. No real surprise this 100-0 on Felsguard. However, as I mentioned, Aldrachi is really within a couple percent, so you could absolutely get a top 100 parts and not be trolling your guild by playing Aldrachi on this boss. Felsguard is, always a very, very good option on this boss, however, so that's definitely what I would lean towards recommending, unless you're just unfamiliar with build and playstyle, in which case playing Aldrachi is definitely fine. And as I showed on the other bosses, it's really just Aldrachi focused over Felsguard for Nexus King and hard Felsguard for Demensius. Next, what I want to look at is trinkets. Now, partially, I'm going to go off of what is in the top 100 breakdown, and partially give my own thoughts. So, this does depend on the trinkets that you have, and the most notable thing is typically most of the public parses at this point, if not basically all of them, nobody really has a mythic Screams of a Forgotten Sky yet. You would need a mythic one to match other mythic trinkets. A heroic Screams isn't going to beat mythic trinkets. So, in a lot of cases, we're going to have people that are running mythic trinkets over a heroic Screams, and it won't see much value. However, Plexus Sentinel is a good boss to run this trinket, and in pure single target, it does perform pretty well. So Screams is really only going to be used on a few fights. Namely, the top two would be Plexus Sentinel and Fractalus. Also could be used on Lumathar. And outside of that, the same issue as I mentioned earlier for taking Sack of Terror. Because it has a secondary stat base, instead of agility, you lose about 3% damage by equipping it, and the trinket needs to make up that value, which is easier said than done. But top trinkets here, number one is Antenna. No surprises. Basically, everyone's best depending on the miss rate that you sim. And again, it's more you do need a mythic one to beat out a lot of other trinkets at times. However, it is very powerful. There's also Sigil of the Cosmic Hunt. I think this is a trinket that typically a lot of Demon Hunters did get on Mythic because it's not that great between a lot of specs. Um, so it's just something that a lot of Havocs would have, and it's generally a pretty good single target and basic AoE cleave trinket. And from there, it just kind of depends. A Raz is always good when you're playing Fellscard. It's good with the burst, and then taking Sack of Terror and Screams of Forgotten Sky are really single target only. So those are pretty much all the main contenders for a boss like Plexus Sentinel when you're playing Fellscard. For Lumathar, it's going to depend on what you're playing, but again, a Raz's Ritual Forge for Fellscard, very good. For Aldrachi Reaver, a Raz is not recommended. Screams of a Forgotten Sky and Taking Sack are going to perform quite a bit better on a Raz. Or, sorry, quite a bit better on Lumathar for Aldrachi. Sigil, again, just a trinket that a lot of people have. It's not BIS, but it is good, and a lot of people do have it on Mythic already. And then Astral Antenna is going to be seen on every boss, as it's virtually best in slot on every single boss, except for the arguments to be made for the ones that you lose on Demensius. Soulbinder, same thing in the top. We are not going to see Ticking Sacred Screams. Do not run these trinkets on a cleave boss. They're bad. Because you're playing Aldrachi, you really shouldn't be using a Raz. However, it can be used to do extra damage on ad sets. Unyielding Nether Prism and a Raz's can both be used this way. My top parse, at least, was using a Raz, and I had another good one using Nether Prism. Either is pretty good for that. And then you just have stat trinkets or Sigil of Cosmic Hunt, which are pretty good, as well as the usual antenna to be used. For Forge Weaver, it's going to be antenna on top. And then, again, you do not want to use a trinket that does not have the main stat on it, as you lose so much damage on cleave. So there are a odd amount of people using Screams of Forgotten Sky here. However, I think this is more in relation to the fact that your parse depends heavily on two things. One, how much AoE damage does your guild do? And two, how long did your last phase go? The last phase has by far the highest ad density, and if you get an extra 15 to 20 seconds in that phase, that's kind of what makes or breaks your parse on this fight. So, I do think the trinkets that show up here are not necessarily good towards what you should run, but I think taking Sack of Terror is pretty much banned, and Screams of Forgotten Sky is not recommended. Sigil of the Cosmic Hunt's good because agility based, so you're going to keep doing your AoE damage. Any stat trinkets are also fine as well. Next will be Soul Hunters. Again, Ticking Sack, banned. Do not run it. Screams, banned. Do not run it. Stat trinkets are just going to perform better, even though there's people running these. As I mentioned, I like Fellscard on this boss. That would make it an Raz boss for sure with Fellscard. So Raz's Ritual Forge plus Astral Antenna would be your best combo. You can also use Sigil in a pinch, depending on what you have. It's just going to depend what sim's best for you in 3 target. As for Fractalus, this is where Screams and Taking Sack would shine. However, it would depend on your other trinkets, because you're likely you're going to have to stop using an on-use and not run Eraz's Ritual Forge, which, considering the kill times on this boss now, is going to heavily hurt your damage, as they're getting down to the 4.5 minute mark, where you're just perfectly getting 3 uses of Eraz, and then the boss dies. Um, so I think Eraz is favored because of that. And taking sack isn't particularly great for Felsguard, so I think Raz is preferred over it, but it is still a good option as it's a pure single target boss. And while Screams is good, it's better on longer fight timers due to the fact that it has stacking damage, and you don't really get as good of use out of this because this fight is now coming below the 5 minute mark, so Screams is going to be a little bit less relevant on this boss. Again, Sigil, just really common. Lots of us have a Mythic Sigil, and the item level is just going to win out in a lot of cases. And Astral Intent is actually insanely good on this boss, as you have such small amounts of movement and play around the same general area, so you should have near 100% pickup chance on those antennas, as well as being able to really easily kite them out for better parts of your rotation, making sure you have them for higher burst windows. So antenna's even better on this boss compared to pretty much everything else. Now for Nexus King, I touched on this earlier, but I think Nether Prism is a great tool for progression, and it lets you have a massive burn window going into the boss burn at phase 2, where you're dealing double damage to the dragon for 30 seconds. So you can just have like a 40% damage amp from Nether Prism saved up for that phase, and on early progression, you could set it on your ad set side if you're struggling to get through that point to see further into the fight. So I think Nether Prism is actually insanely good on this fight. Antenna, due to the amount of movement, loses a lot of value, and you're actually going to lose a lot of orbs. However, if you have a mythic one, it's still a good option. Sigil of the Cosmic Hunt is oddly popular, though I don't think it's actually too insanely good on this fight. I would recommend, personally, uh, sticking to an on-use trinket plus antenna, or some other form of stat trinket. And lastly, we have Demensius. Demensius is going to be pretty much the same through and through. You're going to run Eraz's Ritual Forge. Now, the reason that you're running Eraz's Ritual Forge is if you go look at the fight and look at the downtime, there are some things that are going to happen. So, let's look at the downtime on the fight, which is noted here in the purple, and the uptime on the fight, where you get to use your cooldowns. And we're going to notice that Eraz's Ritual Forge gets used on pull and directly at 2 minutes, which means it's going to be up after this forced downtime of about 40 seconds, and you get a set on the first platform of the intermission. So you're going to get a Ritual Forge on that first platform, and then you have a significant amount of extra downtime. You will not use it on the second platform, but it will be up after even more downtime right for the Lust Burn. So you have about a minute of flight time where you're not dealing damage on this fight. And when that is all added together, that leaves a large amount of time for your cooldowns to keep coming back up, including Ritual Forge, greatly increasing the value of it. And then you get one more send of it in phase 3 whenever it lines up with your cooldowns, as well as using it in this double damage window with Lust. So no matter what, Eraz's Ritual Forge is just going to be BIS for Demensius. You're going to see this being run by basically everyone that has access to it. I will note, looking at this, we can see that the number 1 parse is actually a Nether Prism used by this Russian Demon Hunter. This guy has insane item level at 718, so I am curious to at least come in and take a look. But my problem with Nether Prism, theoretically, is all of that downtime where your Ritual Forge is coming back up, you are not getting procs of Nether Prism to get more stacks of it. But in this case, they use it directly on pull, which just uses a stack, and then they save an 18 stack for the first platform, and then they save up stacks again, which I'd estimate is probably about 12 stacks for the Lust Burn. I can come in here and actually take a look at that and see exactly what that looks like. And yes, they get an 18 stack on the first platform, they get a 12 stack in Bloodlust, and then they get another 13 stack on their next meta, and then they're just using it on cooldown. So while it can be used, I think Raz's Ritual Forge is simply a better option, and I would recommend Raz's Ritual Forge over using Unyielding Nether Prism on Demensius. As for a second trinket, Sigil of the Cosmic Hunt, again, seems to be really popular. It's just a great option that a lot of people have. Antenna is notoriously bad on this fight. I know it was mentioned by analysts for like Liquid and Echo that the miss percentage on this trinket on this fight, especially in phase 3, got up to be nearly 40%. And when you sim it, there's just better options. So Sigil of the Cosmic Hunt is going to win at that point. Depending on the trinkets that you have, you may want to run Antenna anyways. However, I do not recommend it on this boss, and I would recommend something like a Raz plus Sigil. Now, this ended up being a longer video than I expected, but I got to go through all my thoughts on the different 2 specs in the raid, what bosses they're better on, as well as all the trinkets, which I know have been getting asked about relentlessly. Um, what I will note is, as I mentioned earlier in the video, if you're looking to raid in Manaforge Omega and you only want to play one build, Felsguard or Aldrachi, go for Aldrachi Reaver. Aldrachi Reaver is a lot more versatile. It fits pretty much any damage profile, even if it's not the best at it. It's very good. And the fights where it is worse than Felsguard, it's typically only a couple percent of DPS behind. Felsguard on the bosses where Aldrachi is better, Felsguard falls significantly behind as it loses so much priority damage in single target when there is another mob present. So, for example, on Nexus King, anytime you're hitting both the Nexus Drake plus Nexus King himself, you're going to be losing a significant amount of damage. The ad platforms aren't well suited to it, as well as the fact that you need a lot of priority damage and issues like that. Now, that is just about all my thoughts on Havoc Demon Hunter in Manaforge Omega. I do have guides for both Felsguard and Aldrachi Reaver, which will be in the description down below the video, as well as Mythic Plus guides for them that will be in there as well. If you like this video, please leave a like, maybe a comment if there's something that you have any questions about or disagree on. I always like to hear anything. And if you want to keep up to date with Havoc Demon Hunter, you can follow me on my channel. You can also catch me live at twitch.tv/Shotarek. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.